everywhere.
Well, good evening and welcome to the Intimate Marriage Workshop. My name is Dick Lehman and my wife Susie, and we are actually going to cover all the material in tab number 5, which is the title for this evening is The Effect of the Fall on Marriage, Part 3, and an alternative to conflict, which is Empathic Dialogue. If you remember from last time, we talked about a continuum. It's actually from page 20 in your notebooks if you want to look at that. But in the continuum, I talked about one extreme, which on the left would be conflict avoidant, all the way to the other extreme, which is volatile. And we find that couples will fall anywhere on this continuum. Some couples go right to the volatile side where they're really saying some things that are pretty loud at times and pretty hurtful and what you might actually call a fight. Other couples will say they don't fight at all and they're more conflict avoidant, but they disagree on issues and they often won't really work through the issues in a productive way. And so we're trying to recommend that because of the fall, you will be dealing with conflicts of one sort or another, at least disagreements of one sort or another.
Yep.
I like how John Gottman calls them regrettable incidents. You'll have a regrettable incident from time to time, and you're either on this side of the continuum or on this side of the continuum. Well, tonight, we want to find a way to move you towards center. So the ones that are avoidant move to center, the ones that are volatile move to center, and have this kind of interaction with one another that we call validating. I like one author who described the middle section, he called it confiding.
Yeah.
When you learn how to confide in each other, it's much softer and much deeper and much more meaningful. Now, last time I also made reference to the Gottman chart, and that's on page 23 if you're in your notebook. And in the Gottman chart, I describe a couple where on the left side, it describes them as very emotionally close. We call it intimacy. We'll talk about intimacy more in a moment. But they do the kind of things that cause them to be close. Then that couple may at times have a conflict. A lot of times the conflict that they have shows up in a negative way called the 4 horsemen, which is criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. And they'll have the kind of negative interaction that needs to have a repair in order for them to go back to the left side and be close again. And so we'll be talking more next session about the repair, what happens when a couple has a conflict and how do they repair that relationship. But tonight we're going to give an alternative to a couple in terms of instead of having a conflict, they can have a meaningful dialogue. And what does that look like? Now, a couple that don't do this well often will end up on the far right side, which is distance and isolation. And so if they live over here, they're not going to be close.
Right.
They're not going to have an intimate relationship. And so I'd like to begin our session tonight by talking about what I often find in my interactions with people, in day-to-day interactions, where someone will say to me, or I'll say to them, "How are you?" And what do they typically say?
Fine.
I'm fine. And I love the definition of fine, which is feelings inside, not expressed. Now, if it's somebody that I know really well and we're in an awkward place where they couldn't tell me the truth of how they're doing, I just say fine and keep moving, we'll talk later.
Yeah.
But for so many people, fine is all you get. All you get is the, I'm okay, I'm fine, I'm not going to talk about what's going on inside. Well, in marriage, that would be a problem. It would be a problem to say fine to a spouse in such a way that says, I'm not going to let you in to the deeper level of who I am. I love the definition of intimacy that I discovered some time ago. I don't remember where I got it, but it was, the word was into me see. When you see into my soul, when you can look into my soul, when I can see into your soul, that's intimacy.
Okay.
And so you'll notice page 33 in your notebook. Here is what I call 5 levels of communication. And so in the interaction, couples will, or individuals will in the world about us, they'll talk on the level of a cliche, fact, or opinion levels, which is pretty surfacey. Cliche is almost, there's no personal revealing in that.
Right.
You know, have a nice day. What do you think of the weather? That kind of thing. Talking about the facts or the tasks or the news, that can be a little more disclosure, but not much. Talking on a feeling level is more disclosure. When I have an opinion about sports maybe, or politics, or different areas of interest in my life, you have opinions as well. There's a little bit more disclosure. But so many couples just have a relationship built on the top three levels of cliche, fact, and opinion. And it's fine to have that kind of interaction with people in the world about us. But it's a problem if it doesn't ever get down to what I consider levels 4 and 5. The level 4 is the level of feelings. What's going on inside and how are you feeling emotionally? And so I will often ask people in my office what they're feeling, and they'll say, I feel that I should do such and such. And I say, that's not a feeling, that's a thought. You're thinking that you should do such and such. Emotionally, what are you feeling? Give me a feeling word. And so then they're getting into, well, I feel frustrated, or I feel nervous, or I feel anxious, I feel embarrassed, whatever it is. And then down to the deepest level, I think our core beliefs and our longings. Our goal tonight is to help couples get down to the feelings and longing level, get down to levels of personal, emotional disclosure in a way that's really, really meaningful for them. Now, just to throw a little humor into this, I'll read the bottom part first. This is what a wife says to her husband. Honey, why don't we turn off the TV and just talk? And that's what she said, literally, that's what she said. Why don't we turn off the TV and just talk? What he heard was, honey, why don't you put your head in a vise and I'll turn the handle until your skull explodes. And I'm afraid sometimes that is actually true, that when men hear their wives say they want to talk, they immediately assume they're in trouble, and they immediately assume they're going to talk about things that they're not comfortable talking about.
Which may be true.
Which may be true. But tonight, we're not talking about having a conversation necessarily where one person is upset with the other, or one person has an issue to address. We'll talk about that too. But just to have normal conversations that get down to the deeper levels, and I want to make this a non-threatening experience for those who would think they're having their head put in a vise and it's going to explode.
Right.
Okay? Page 34 in your notebook is a slide of an iceberg. And you can see the tip of the iceberg is where we have our conscious thoughts and behaviors. And oftentimes, and there's a lot to this slide, so bear with us as we present over the next half hour all this material. You can go back to the slide and make a lot more sense out of it as a result of our presentation. But just think in terms of above the waterline is the surface level, and going down deeper into the deepest parts of who we are. And so you take the feeling level at the surface and bring it down to a deeper level. Take the thoughts that are at the surface, bring it down to our core beliefs. Take the wants and needs and bring it down to our longings. And oftentimes, a lot of our deepest core beliefs come from our family history.
Yes. Definitely.
And so we would actually like to encourage couples to be able to have the kind of conversations that get them down below the waterline into the deepest levels of who they are. And we'll teach a tool that will show us how we do that. So let's begin with, on page 27, you'll see in your notebook how the empathic dialogue creates a structure. And Susie, why don't you talk about that for a few minutes?
This is something that has really been a huge help in our marriage. Some people might feel that it's a little bit too structured or a little bit mechanical, but once you get used to using it, a few times you can start to do it more automatically. So the first thing that it does, I feel, is that it creates safety in facilitating conversation that you might not have otherwise, that you can actually bring up a difficult issue and talk about it in a way that's not volatile or extremely emotional. It also allows the speaker to feel valued. Maybe there have been times when you've brought up something, but you felt like, that was dismissed, or you didn't get through the whole conversation about it, or it led to some other thing, or it led to defensiveness or whatever. But if you do this in the way that we're going to teach you how to do it, the speaker should feel validated and safe. I think it allows you to feel like your partner is your ally, and that, okay, I can be sure that Dick is going to listen to me. I'm going to have this opportunity to really go deep on something that has been bothering me, and to go through the whole process so that he understands me. And so I feel like it puts couples on the same page when they are doing this. And at the end of that, even if it's a topic that's been a very difficult topic, you can feel really close that you had that opportunity to share and that your partner actually listened to you through
I
it.
actually had an interesting experience last week. I was doing a session with a couple on Zoom, and I was actually coaching them to have this kind of conversation we're talking about tonight. And at the end of it, it was actually one of my first, it's probably number 3 as far as the times that I've done it on Zoom, so this is a new technology for me. But anyways, at the end of it, the woman said, this is the closest I've felt to my husband in a long time. She said, this is the most meaningful conversation we've had in our marriage. And I thought, wow, just teaching and coaching couples how to do this can provide that kind of emotional closeness in a short period of time.
Yeah. There's a few things that the speaker needs to do, and let's pretend I'm the speaker in this situation where we're going to do the empathic dialogue. So the first thing is to what we call setting the table, where you think about some preparation ahead of time, that you don't just bring up something that could be brought up at a bad time. You need to think ahead, like, I'll ask you what your schedule is, and like, do you have some free time tomorrow night? I have something I need to talk about, or I'd like to do the wheel on a topic. And
that's when my hair goes straight up.
and that's when I have an issue. And you might say, well, I have time tonight. I'd like to talk about it tonight. But it just prepares the listener for that we're going to have this conversation.
So timing and readiness.
Timing and readiness. It's very, very important to start softly. We're going to talk about a harsh startup versus starting with softness, having a self-focus rather than, throwing something on you right away and attacking you. It's not anything like that. It's very important that when your husband or when the wife is speaking, if you're listening, that person doesn't use any sarcasm, doesn't respond with rolling of the eyes like, oh, you do understand me, or, well, why haven't you ever, just leave those comments, leave those impulses. Grab hold of that in your mind, like we talked about, taking control of every thought. This is very important that you don't bring up anything in a way that will cause the other person to be defensive. Keep your statements brief, because it's very hard for the person listening to understand and be able to reflect back if they understood it. If you talk for 15 minutes on one thing, explaining how deeply you feel about it. So it's important to keep it brief enough. And then you don't want to move on to the action steps, which is the last step in the wheel, quickly. That's the tendency that I think all of us want to do when we're talking to somebody we care about and they're bringing up an issue that's bothering them. We want to fix it, and so we want to jump like, oh yeah, I understand you. Let's talk about what can we do about this and get to the action plan. So sometimes we don't get to the action plan until the next day even. Like, we just focus on the sharing part, the sharing and the understanding, and then finally, we can even, sometimes we'll think about it and say, let's just think about this. What should we do about this, and get back together and talk about some of our ideas about what we can do about it. So that's kind of briefly the process you want to go through in doing this.
So what we're talking about, what we're calling this is empathic dialogue. How to have a conversation with a spouse that is meaningful, that shows empathy, that gets down to the deeper level. And what you just described was the speaker's role. So
Right.
at the beginning of a conversation, you decide who's going to be the speaker and who's going to be the listener. And there's different roles. So the speaker does what you just described in terms of setting the table, speaking softly, being brief, and sharing it in a way that the other person can receive it. Well, what does the listener do? Well, the listener actually is described on page 27, but the listener wants to make it safe. You're doing a risky thing in bringing up something to me, and you might feel a little nervous. You might feel a little bit vulnerable. You might feel a little scared of how I will react or how I will respond. And so I want to make it feel safe for you. I want to make it feel like you can talk to me about whatever you're concerned about or whatever you need in a way that, that feels safe. And so you can relax. It may not feel natural to do an empathic dialogue the way we're going to describe it, but I assure you that even though you may feel awkward in the beginning, after you do it a while, it'll become more and more natural. And I do it in my office all the time as a professional counselor. It actually may feel awkward at first, but then it actually it slows the conversation down. A lot of times what you really need to go deeper is to slow the pace. And so like you said, people who want to just fix it, they want the conversation to be over. But if you want the conversation to be extended, then you need to slow it down by doing what we call the empathic dialogue. And so it's important to be able to listen without feeling defensive. I think the critical issue in so many couples is the issue of defensiveness. I can see defensiveness all the time in the way people listening to each other and the way they respond to each other. And so it's not easy, but to be listening in a non-defensive way is really, really important. On page 28, you'll notice the acronym called ROLES, and that's just a way of describing being fully present. So we had a conversation with somebody on Zoom yesterday, good friends of ours, and he pulled out a newspaper, and it reminded me back in the early days when I was working with him, he always had a newspaper that he was looking at when his wife was talking to him, and that's not good. You put the newspaper down.
Well, he was a journalist.
Yeah, so. or put your cell phone away, close your laptop or turn off the TV and be fully present and look at the person. Relax, be open, lean forward, give them good eye contact and face them directly, just to show that you really want to be a good listener to them. And stay focused on the other person's message. So the hard part sometimes, it feels a little unnatural, is not to react to it or to say rebuttals.
That's what I was just thinking.
Or to be defensive or try to fix things right away. Or try to refute the message. You're not right about that. You're wrong. I didn't do that because you think, a listener is not going to be refuting the message. They're receiving the message, and later they'll have the opportunity to dialogue about different perspectives. So it's very important that the listener then paraphrases what they hear their spouse say. That's the part that might feel a little bit awkward. You want to slow down, you want to stop, and you want to say back to the other person what you heard them say. That's one of the reasons why it's helpful for speakers to be a little briefer so that listeners have the opportunity to say back what they heard. A lot of times in my office, I'll hear a spouse talk for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, and then I'll say, can you just stop right here? I would like the other person to say back what you heard them say. That does 2 things. One is it gives them the opportunity to show whether they actually understood what their partner is saying. And sometimes people will say back things that are totally off the mark, and so they need to restate it so they fully get it, okay? So to show that I really heard you, and I can say back to you what I heard you say, is showing that I understand. It also really is a powerful way of connecting with a spouse, because the spouse realizes sometimes in some couples' cases, some marriages, it's almost like the first time that they feel like their partner really listened to them. You're really listening to me when you say back to me what you've heard me say. You're not just moving on to the next thing or giving me a rebuttal or whatever. So reflect back to the listener and paraphrase until you get it. And then here's one point on page 28. It says the listener validates. Remember when I said there's a continuum from conflict avoidant to volatile, and in the middle is validating? Mm-hmm. The listener validates by expressing that they understand and they affirm the other person's perception of reality. That doesn't mean they necessarily agree with it, but it does mean that they value what the other person said well enough that they validate what they're saying and they affirm that person's perception of reality. And so they can actually say, you know, that makes sense to me, coming from your perspective, coming from our history, coming from what's been going on in your life. I can see why you feel the way you feel and how you came to the conclusions you came to. We can talk later about how you can share a different perception, but at this time it's very, very important for the listener to validate. And that's the piece that oftentimes is missing. When I work with couples in my office, a lot of times they can summarize, but they don't necessarily validate. Mm-hmm. And so I'll have to stop them and say, I need you to validate by showing your partner how you value what they've shared.
Would that be a good time to maybe ask clarifying questions?
Sure. Individuals can always, the listeners can always ask clarifying questions. Yeah. They can always ask for additional information or additional perspective.
Or one of the hardest questions I have found is to say, can you give me more examples of that? For instance, if it's an issue of my having been very controlling about a certain decision, and you're bringing up a complaint to me, and if I say, it's really hard to say it, it feels like I'm dying to myself when I say it, but I'll say, do you have any other examples?
Do you want me to give our audience all the examples that are in my head right now?
Well, it's you know, I kind of choke on it when I say that to you, but it's really important for me to understand how important this issue is to you.
Yeah. Oftentimes, the way I say it, both in our relationship as well as in my office, is what an incident represents. Yeah. And a lot of times, an incident in and of itself doesn't seem like a big deal, but when it has a lot of history to it, it then takes on a representation, you know what I'm talking about, where it represents something, and there's more emotion attached to that. It's a trigger. Mm-hmm. And so we can actually talk about triggers and emotional content to it. That's why it's very important for the listener to empathize. And to empathize is to express what you think the other person is feeling, what their emotions are, and you must have been feeling this, or you must have felt this. Yeah. And so it becomes really, really important that the person demonstrates that they're willing to listen on the feeling level and empathize with those feelings. I'd like to just draw your attention to a tool that we've been using called the awareness wheel. And in the awareness wheel, you'll see there's the outside of the wheel, which I call the seer. Seer is something that I got from the Yurkoviches. Some of you may remember we had the Yurkoviches at our church many years ago, probably about, 10 years ago now. Yeah. And they had something called the comfort circle, and I've kind of modified it and adapted it to this awareness wheel diagram that you see. But the outside part of it is the process that you have with a couple. So for example, seeking awareness, we'll talk about all of these in a minute. Seeking awareness is what a person does individually as they think through an issue for themselves. Then the engage is when they actually have the conversation with each other. Mm-hmm. Then they explore and they go deeper in that conversation as they go around the wheel exploring the particular issue in their conversation. And then they work towards resolving that issue with an action plan. And so the outside of the wheel is really designed to describe the process. The inside of the wheel is the content of that process.
Right.
So think process and then think content. So we're going to go through each of these one by one. And top of page 29, you'll see notes with regard to this step-by-step process. And the first one is to seek awareness. So Susie, why don't you describe what that's like?
Yeah, so in the back of this tab, you'll see that there are some examples of awareness wheel notes that are blank, and you can use that to fill out before you actually ask for some time to go over an issue. What I usually do is try to think through what it is, try to organize my thoughts of what is the issue I want to discuss. And then I think through what are the facts related to this issue. Maybe if it's an issue of like a conflict that we're having, I'll name some of the facts. Yes, this goes back 20 years since the beginning of our marriage, or this goes back, or I can remember
40 years. So.
40 years, when I did this 10, 20 years ago. What are the facts involved in this issue? It could be a current issue where something has come up and you have to list the facts. And then how do I feel about it? What are some of my feelings? And we're going to give you a tab that describes a lot of different feelings, and or a handout in here. Mm-hmm. With that, and then the most important part, I think, is the thoughts. This requires the most self-reflection for me, and probably for everyone, is what does this represent? Why do I have such strong feelings? A lot of times the feelings we have are just like the lights on a dashboard. It just lets us know that there's something going on in the engine within us, deeper within us. The stronger the feelings, that means it's probably connected to some very important belief system that we've developed throughout our lives, a core belief, and that's what you do when you are examining your own thoughts about it. How does this relate to my childhood? How does this relate to something that I currently am believing about life, making life work? And then you want to go on to think about what are my wants and what are my needs. And maybe you don't even know that yet. Maybe you have to work through the whole thing with your partner to get to that wants and needs. Maybe right now I just want clarification about how I feel or mm-hmm. why I feel that way. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, we go to the action part.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll walk you through it, and we'll actually have a demonstration of it just a little later on so that you can begin to make sense of it. Now on page 29, I do have a list of examples for topics for the awareness wheel. You'll see that a little later on page 36 in your notebook is that same list of topics. And by the way, let me make a comment that some of these items actually came from earlier in the notebook when I presented it on page 15 of things that we tend to avoid, things that we're not dealing with in our life, and so oftentimes couples will have conflicts over those issues, and so I put that here on page 29. There's a line there in the middle of that list, and the line pertains to a distinction between what is a topic just related to me, in other words, my own personal issue, so my relationship with God, my childhood, my parents, my challenges with my relatives, my emotional struggles, my work, my stresses, my friendships, all things pertaining to me personally. Mm-hmm. Below that line are things that pertain to us. So the things that pertain to us are sometimes a little bit more conflictual. They may be areas where there's more sensitivity. Oh, yeah. And so the issues that are brought up pertaining to us become more significant in terms of having a meaningful empathic dialogue that is non-defensive and that is healthy for the relationship. So talking about our marriage, talking about our spiritual life, our sexual relationship, our division of labor, meaning household chores. It's amazing how often this comes up with couples where one person is not pulling their load and dealing with what they need to deal with in the household. Our finances sometimes is a painful topic for some. The children, of course, is an important topic for couples if they have children in their home. and then decisions that need to be made and future planning. So this is just a list of sample things that couples could talk about in the awareness wheel. It's interesting that at the very beginning, when you all registered for this workshop, I asked you to put down what are the things you'd like to learn in this workshop. And so many of the things that you said that you wanted to learn was communication about these kinds of issues.
Yeah.
To be able to have a
hard.
conversation with your spouse about these kinds of issues and deepen the communication is what you requested as essential for your experience here in the marriage workshop. In fact, I would say that while I like all of the material in the whole notebook, if you look at tab 5 and what we're talking about in tab 5, this is the heart of what you asked for. So I hope you're paying attention and willing to do what we're asking you to do. So the second part of it is when a couple actually engages with each other, right?
Yeah,
So
and we've talked about that already. I've addressed that. If you just want to look at that in the notebook, the setting the table is planning for a time, and then just making sure you are prepared as the speaker and you're prepared as the listener, that you're ready and willing to do that.
Yeah, and as you're exploring, let me just point out that you start with the issue. You know, this is what it is that I think that we need to talk about tonight. You go to the facts, kind of reviewing the facts, and the person is listening to what facts you observe or what facts you are aware of, which might be different than their own. And then you get to the level of feelings. And I would actually recommend that when you go through the wheel and you're engaging with your couple and you're exploring it, that you take a look at page 32 in your notebook on feeling words. And the way the feeling word chart here works is there's a title to a list of words underneath, and it goes across the board like this. And so afraid, ashamed, confused, glad, lonely, mad, sad. And then if it's a little feeling, it's up here, but as you go farther down the chart, it becomes an intense feeling. And just circle them or say them as you're looking at them, and use the chart. There are many other feeling word lists out there, so if you find one that you like better, feel free to use it. I just find that couples benefit from being able to look at a list and talking about their feelings.
Yes.
So,
and that's all part of, for the speaker, that's all part of the preparation in being aware of all that. When you decide who's going to be the speaker, it's the person obviously who wants to bring up the issue. One question that might be running through your mind is, will I get to be the speaker in responding to the person who presented the issue, and go through my whole side of it? So if you want to address that.
yeah, there's two different options here.
Okay.
If the issue is relevant for both, okay, in other words, like let's say you chose an issue that just had to do with you,
Yeah, right.
and I don't need to have that time to do the same thing from my perspective as a speaker about you, and so it's just sufficient in and of itself for you to do it. If it's about us, and you have your perspective about us, and I need to have my perspective about us, then go for yours for 45 minutes, I'd say, maybe an hour, and then take a break, maybe go to bed and take a day or two if you need to, then come back to it and say, okay, let's reverse it. So you can either do it in the same setting if you've got the time, or take a break and take turns doing it later.
Yeah, I think it would be important, to me it would be important to have a little space between when you came back and addressed the same issue from your viewpoint, because it could feel like, you know, you've been just waiting to get your
A rebuttal.
comments.
Yeah,
It could feel like a rebuttal.
So again, the goal is to understand, not to agree or argue the different viewpoints. And we're on page 30, so let's take a look at those statements there.
Yeah. To go slow in what you're saying, keep your sentences short.
And the listener actually might use those same notes that are on page, at the end of the tab page 36 and beyond, to write down what they hear their partner saying.
Yeah.
And so not responding directly other than to what they've heard and acknowledging what they've heard. And if it gets kind of emotional, what do?
Yeah, I think it can get very emotional, but if it's becomes volatile, then you need to take a break. You need to just stop and say, let's take a break. Let's just cool down. We'll be sharing different other repair attempts. You might try something like that. When you learn about that, that can really help. And then move on back to it.
And so the speaker is sharing the contents of the wheel, and the listener is exploring it with them. So
Right.
if you were the speaker and I was the listener, I would be exploring your feelings. I would explore your thoughts and potential core beliefs. One of the ways that I do this with couples in my office, and I'm sure we've done it with us, is I'll ask questions pertaining to marital history,
Yeah.
which is a gutsy thing to ask, but it's a good question. So whatever this issue is, what's the history of it in our marriage? Would you talk about that a little bit? Then I will sometimes say, okay, is there any history that precedes our marriage? Is there a time where you actually felt the same way earlier in your life?
Yeah.
And that's oftentimes, that just takes the lid off of the deeper stuff, where a person says, you know, I felt this very same way in reference to my father.
Yeah.
And I felt this way as a little girl, and this is what I felt with him, and I'm feeling the same thing with you. And I just realized that underneath it are some core thoughts, core beliefs of how I see myself, some vows that some people have made at times because of those early childhood experiences, some lies that they've actually embraced and believed. And so while the speaker is trying to explore that, the listener is trying to draw it out. They're trying to ask more questions to draw it out. Well, tell me about what happened when you were 8 years old.
I know.
What is it, the memory that you have? And
Yeah, you're so good at that. You're so good at saying, how did you feel when that happened? When I've described like a time when my father was blowing up at my mother, you know, and how that impacted me as a little girl. And that might be in the context of my bringing up an issue of how I feel if you get angry at me, or how difficult it is for me if you have a criticism about me or a complaint. You can see how you can tie that to your childhood belief systems and experiences.
Page 35 are some examples of core beliefs. And I just have a sampling of them, but you can see there, these are the kinds of things that often come up when couples will have a conversation that gets deeper. They go beyond the feelings down to the core thoughts and beliefs based on childhood experiences. They will often identify themselves as feeling not good enough, not smart enough, not acceptable, unwanted, defective, powerless, not safe. I actually went through this with a client just a few days ago, and this individual said, I have all of these.
Oh,
so
dear.
they can identify with a lot of the things there. By the way, I just want to mention to our audience that I intend to, it just didn't make it to the publication of this notebook, but I intend to give you another sheet of paper that would follow page 35, so call it 35B, on biblical truths and biblical affirmations that would counteract these false beliefs,
that's great.
or lies that we might call them. And so I think that's yet to come. I'll find a way to get that to you. But that's a way of thinking through, okay, this is what I need to work on to change some of those thoughts and beliefs that I have.
Right, because we want to move on from what is in our mind as a false belief to holding on to what is true.
You'll notice that I said that on page 30, it's H, where it says, is there an earlier time in your life when you felt that way?
Yeah.
So that's what we're talking about.
Okay.
So then we're now to the place of resolving it. What does resolving it look like?
So we're getting down to talking about what my wants and needs are, and we have discussed all the other parts very well. this is the part where the speaker is sharing her wants and needs or his wants and needs, and the listener is validating that and thinking through with you, what are we going to do about this, and what is our plan of action going to be based on this? So some things.
So then, if you're asking for what you want and your need, then I would have to think in terms of, am I willing to meet those needs? Am I willing to do this? And so if the listener says that he or she would like to work on that, would like to make that change, or would like to implement the plan, and that could be so encouraging to the speaker.
Yeah.
Now, just a word of caution, if you as a listener make a commitment to do that, then it's really important to follow through. And so often in my office, I will hear a listener commit to doing something for the speaker as agreed upon, and then they either forgot about it or they didn't follow through, and that can be painful. And so I just want to acknowledge that and stress the importance of, can you commit to it? Can you follow through with it?
Yeah.
So,
are you going to talk about the solvable and the
I
unsolvable?
don't have that in my notes, but
He said
did I say I was
solving
gonna
the
say something about
solvable.
that? Okay. Yeah, I mean,
Some things are not solvable.
all of these issues that we've talked about before, especially on the ones about marriage, on page 36, you'll see about us as a couple. They can be divided into solvable and unsolvable things.
Yeah.
And so
That's what I
the
was
action
thinking
plan really pertains to the solvable ones. The ones that are unsolvable, you basically end up having to affirm how the other person feels, but do it in a way that really validates the emotional challenge of it without committing to actually changing in that area.
Yeah.
And in some cases, the action plan is just to accept and live with it.
Yeah.
I mean, you could talk about the issue of my hearing loss, but that's not going to change. I mean, my hearing loss is what it is, and so you have to live with my hearing loss and accept it, as opposed to, asking me to hear you better. That's
Or
not going to
respond way differently in a group or something like that.
Right. And so there's a lot of things that we have to work on accepting. And maybe the wheel is just simply a way of going deeper in the conversation to get to acceptance and affirmation.
I like that.
So, my example of a solvable or unsolvable issue sometimes is an in-law, like a mother-in-law.
Right.
And you're not going to solve the issue of how she behaves, but you might be able to have an understanding in such a way that you can say, let's deal with this a little differently.
Yes.
Let's have an action plan about how we deal with the intrusiveness of the mother-in-law, if that's the issue. So.
I think that's good.
By the way, on page 36, I just thought I'd mention this. There's one in there that actually kind of a interesting one to me. It's what bugs me in our relationship. Now, you can imagine that topic would just stir up all kinds of things with couples. Yurkoviches are the ones that actually came up with that, and my understanding of what they were intending by that is, if there's something about your spouse that annoys you, it's not so much that your spouse does that, it's what's that about for you?
Yeah.
What is it in me that causes me to be bothered by that? And a lot of times there's something about me that I need to learn and explore, and so why is that so important to me? What is the history of that for me? And let's talk about that rather than me just being mad at you for bugging me.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that's powerful. That makes me remember a conversation a friend of mine came to me about, saying, I don't think you are disciplining one of your children as like you should. And she was really upset, and she was even angry about it. And I thought, well, I can deal with that. It could be on me, but why are you so angry about this? What is it about you and your whole idea about everything that this is so important to you that it evokes feelings of anger, that I don't do this the way you want me to? So that's an example of how it would have been a good opportunity for us to do the wheel on why she feels that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
Interesting.
the other night, when was this? A couple days ago, there was an interaction which we're not going to make public. We're not going to tell you what the interaction was. But there was something that I did that hurt your feelings. Yeah. And what did you do? Do you remember?
Well, I went out and went for a drive first. Got out of the house, stewed a little bit, mm-hmm. and I kept thinking, why did that make me feel this way? And then I came back and we were having supper, and you acknowledged it first. Mm-hmm. You said, "Did I hurt your feelings?" And I said, "Yes, but I'd rather eat supper and we can talk about it when we're done."
She actually wanted to postpone the conversation, so you did.
And, you know, and we kind of did the wheel. It wasn't maybe in perfect order, but we talked about what the issues were, what the facts are, and I thought about what facts were connected to this incident that made me assume certain things, mm-hmm. or question why you said something or did something. And we worked through it, and it was a 40-minute conversation that really helped. It really kind of got down to the bottom of my misunderstanding some things, misinterpreting some things that happened in regard to this.
Did you feel better after our conversation?
Oh yes, I felt much better. I got to the point where it's like, okay, I understand. It really helped me, and then I said, I can put that aside. I totally understand where I got that wrong, you know, in my being hurt by this.
Mm-hmm. Turn back again to page 31 of the awareness wheel. And this is a tool that we're encouraging you to learn how to do. So let me go to the outside of it just to review. So seeking awareness is the person who individually is thinking through what's an issue that I have, how have I been triggered, what are my feelings and needs about this issue. They then kind of work through the wheel in their notes. So they review the issue, the facts, the feelings, their thoughts, their wants and needs, and an action plan. They try to think it through enough that they have something to talk about with their spouse. Then they set the table by deciding when and where, and request to the spouse that they would like to have a discussion, and then they explore it. And so they determine who's the speaker and who's the listener, and the speaker will talk about the issue, the facts, the feelings, the thoughts, the wants and needs, and the action. The listener will summarize each of those, try to get the person to go deeper. You know, what are some other facts that you've not indicated? Maybe there's some other ones. How about your feelings? How deep are they? You know, look at the feeling word list. What are some thoughts you have? What is the history here? Making sure that you validate the feelings and validate the thoughts and help connect this with past experiences. And then lead the person to ask for what they need and decide on an action plan. So that's the wheel in a nutshell. On page 36, I actually have a place where you can write down what are the issues you'd like to discuss with your partner. And then over time, you can actually make several items on here as you're thinking about it, but then when do you actually discuss it? And so you'll notice that you know, this one has room for 11. I would love it if in the marriage workshop you start working through this in a way that you have several that you're done before the semester is over. And I would suggest that you take 30 minutes alone sometime and just think through what are the things you'd like to be able to talk about with your spouse. Either things about yourself personally or things about the marriage that you would like to talk about, and then just start filling out the notes on page 37 or right after 36, this awareness wheel notes where you can start writing in what you're thinking about. And then so spend a half hour, spend more time if you want, and look at page 31, look at page 36, 37, and then have the dialogue with your spouse. And plan on 45 minutes to an hour, and just try it out. And then have a discussion with your table group when you're able to talk about how it went and what were the things that were helpful to you, what were the things that you weren't clear about, and how do you practice this in a way that becomes meaningful for you as a couple. My wife and I have actually had lots of great conversations using the wheel. I can remember when we drove back from Chicago and we did a wheel illustration that took several hours in the car. So it's something that you have to work on and practice, and then over time you can develop. And if you would like me to help you with that, I'd be happy to work with any of you couples to practice the wheel. Now in this current situation, we could do it by Zoom, and I could have you guys be in front of a computer camera, and I could actually walk you through the wheel in your exercise with each other. So if any of you are interested in that, I'd be very available to do that over the course of the next several weeks before this semester is over. So thank you. Let me just close in prayer. Father, I know that this may be a challenging presentation tonight, challenging both in terms of understanding it and learning a new tool that some couples have not learned and are just practicing for the first time. It also can be challenging not only in terms of learning how to use a new tool, but to actually have the conversations on a deeper level with their spouse. And Father, I pray that good things can come from this, that couples, as they even just do above the line topics about themselves personally that doesn't have to do with the marriage, just to deepen the intimacy, deepen the awareness of what's going on inside of each other. And so, Father, I pray that you would use this in a way that really can be helpful in strengthening the intimacy that couples long for in their marriage. Amen. We thank you, we pray, in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.